"Just take the coat. He doesn't need it anymore." That's what the man behind the counter said. Not cruel, not loud, just flat, like he was talking about a winter jacket at a garage sale and not the dress uniform of a man who had served this country for 31 years. The old man standing at the counter didn't flinch. Aubrey Okafor, and that name matters, so remember it, had learned a long time ago not to flinch at things that were meant to hurt him. He'd learned that in Petawawa. He'd learned it again in Bosnia. He'd learned it a third time, the hardest time, in a government office in Ottawa, where a woman who'd never left the province told him his disability claim was insufficient for full consideration. He set the coat on the glass counter with both hands, slowly, the way you set something down when you know it's the last time. It was a Tuesday in February, the kind of Tuesday that Toronto saves for people who have run out of better options. The kind where the wind comes off the lake like it has a personal grievance. Aubrey Okafor had taken the streetcar because his car hadn't started in 11 days, and he hadn't called a mechanic because he already knew what was wrong with it, and he already knew he couldn't afford to fix it. He was 61 years old, and he knew how to fix the car himself, had once rebuilt an engine in a forward operating base in 40-degree heat with a broken wrist and 2 missing tools. But he needed parts, and parts cost money, and money was the one thing he no longer had a way to get. The coat was the last thing of value he owned that wasn't a photograph. He'd kept it in a garment bag in the back of his closet for 14 years. His daughter had asked him once, when she was maybe 9 or 10, why he never wore it. He'd told her it was for special occasions. She'd asked what kind of occasion. He'd said the kind you hope never comes. He hadn't meant to tell her that, it came out anyway. The pawn shop on Dundas was called Goldstein's, though the man behind the counter wasn't named Goldstein. His name was Peter Lack, and he'd worked there for 17 years, and he had a talent, a genuine, almost professional talent, for making people feel like whatever they'd brought in was worth less than they thought, and they should feel vaguely embarrassed for having thought otherwise. He looked at the coat. He looked at the medals. The Victoria Cross wasn't there. Aubrey hadn't earned that, and wouldn't claim otherwise. But the medals on that chest represented 31 years, 4 deployments, 2 injuries that had left permanent damage, and 1 moment in a burning building in Kandahar that nobody outside a closed briefing room had ever been told about. One of those medals bore the words bravery. The words were small. They always are. Peter Lack looked at all of it for about 4 seconds. 120 for the coat, 40 for the hardware. Aubrey Okafor said nothing for a moment. He'd done the math before he came. He needed $260. That was the number. His heating bill, plus enough groceries to last until the end of the month, plus the prescription that he'd been skipping every other day because the full dose cost what it cost, $260. He was a 61-year-old man who had run 2 platoons and been responsible for the lives of people who had mothers and children and reasons to come home. And right now, the number standing between him and a manageable February was $260. $160 total, Aubrey said. Not a question. I can do 170 if the buttons are original. Aubrey looked at the buttons. Of course the buttons were original. What did the man think he'd done, swap them out? They're original, he said. 170 then. Aubrey put both hands flat on the glass counter, not in anger, just to steady himself, because the fluorescent light was doing something strange to the room, or maybe it was just that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. And there's a particular kind of lightheadedness that comes from that, one he recognized from the field but had never expected to recognize at a pawn shop in Toronto on a Tuesday in February. He was about to say yes. He had already, in his mind, said yes. He was already calculating. 170 gets him the heating bill and the prescription and maybe 4 days of groceries, and then he'd figure out the rest. He had always figured out the rest. That was what he did. That was when the door opened. The bell above the door was one of those old mechanical ones that sounds less like a bell and more like a complaint. It made its noise, and a cold gust came in from Dundas Street, and behind the cold gust came a young man named Dylan Asare. Dylan Asare was 26 years old and had been back in Canada for 8 months and was still in the way of people who've been away to difficult places, slightly out of phase with the ordinary world. He'd served 4 years with the Royal Canadian Regiment. He'd done 1 rotation in Latvia and 1 in Mali, and he'd come back from Mali quieter than he'd left and hadn't yet found words for why. His mother said he'd come back with something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. She wasn't wrong. He hadn't disagreed with her. He just didn't know what to do about it yet. He was at Goldstein's because he had his grandmother's watch. His grandmother had pressed it into his hands at the airport when he left for his first posting, and had said something in Twi that he hadn't fully understood, and when he came back, she was already in the home and didn't always know his name anymore. The watch was a Tissot. Old, wind-up, worth something to someone, probably. He didn't want to sell it. He needed $70 to cover a gap in his rent that had opened up when his roommate moved out without warning 3 weeks ago, and he'd borrowed what he could from the people he was willing to borrow from, and $70 was what was left. He walked in and the door swung shut behind him and he looked up at the counter. He saw the coat first. Any veteran sees a dress uniform the same way. It's not a thing. It's a record. Dylan Asare had been out for 8 months and he still could not walk past a uniform without his body doing something involuntary. Some small recalibration, some old reflex that the civilian world hadn't finished erasing. His eyes went to the medals before his brain caught up to what he was looking at. He stopped walking. The man behind the counter was saying something about authentication, about whether a bill of sale would be required, about something. Dylan wasn't listening to him. He was looking at Aubrey Okafor's profile, the straight back, the jaw set the way jaws get set when a person is doing something that costs them something. And he was reading the whole situation the way soldiers learn to read situations, fast and without sentimentality. He understood what was happening in about 3 seconds. He stood there for another 5, very still, the way he'd learned to be still when stillness was what the moment required. Then he walked to the counter. "Excuse me," he said. Peter Lack looked at him with the expression of a man who had seen many people walk into his shop and had learned to categorize them quickly. He started to say something about waiting. Dylan Asare ignored him and turned to Aubrey Okafor. "Sir," he said. Aubrey turned. He looked at Dylan the way older men sometimes look at younger men, not dismissively, but measuring, the way you look at someone and try to figure out who they are before they've had a chance to tell you. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt. My name's Dylan Asare. RCR, 2 Battalion until last year." He paused. "I can see what you have there." Aubrey looked at him for a long moment. His expression didn't change much, but something in the set of his shoulders did. "It's a transaction," Aubrey said. "Not unkindly, just factually." "I understand that," Dylan said. I'm not trying to tell you what to do." He stopped. He wasn't sure what he was trying to say. He only knew that something in him had drawn a line, quietly, without his full permission, and he was not going to be the person who stood in this shop and watched this happen. "How much does he need?" Dylan asked, and he was talking to Peter Lack now. Lack looked between the two of them. "We were in the middle of a, 'How much does he need?'" Dylan said again, and it wasn't a question this time. Aubrey Okafor said quietly, $260. Dylan Asare had $73 in his checking account. He had the watch in his jacket pocket. He had a pre-authorized rent payment going out in 11 days that he did not have enough to cover. He took the watch out of his pocket and set it on the counter next to the dress uniform. "What'll you give me for this?" he said to Lack. What happened next took about 8 minutes. It doesn't always take long, the things that change the texture of a life. Sometimes it takes 8 minutes. Lack examined the Tissot. He offered 110. Dylan pushed back. He knew watches. His grandfather had collected them, and Dylan had grown up listening to the old man talk about movements and cases and the difference between a watch that kept time and a watch that meant something. He got latched to 140. 140 plus the 73 in his account got him to 213. He was $47 short. He looked at the math. He looked at Aubrey Okafor, who was watching all of this with an expression that was very controlled and very complicated, and was, if you looked closely, on the edge of being something he would not allow himself to show in public. Dylan Asare took out his phone. He had a cousin in Brampton. He texted, "Need 50, can pay back end of month, no questions, please." He watched the 3 dots appear. He waited. The shop was very quiet. Peter Lack was polishing something behind the counter with the studied disinterest of a man who had decided this was no longer his business. The reply came back. "Transferred. You good?" He was not going to have rent covered. He was going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with his landlord. He was going to eat a lot of rice and tinned fish for the next 2 weeks, and he was not going to tell his mother why. He looked at Aubrey Okafor and said, I've got it. Aubrey Okafor was not a man who cried easily. He had not cried at his own discharge. He had not cried at his mother's funeral, though he'd felt it deeply enough that it had taken something out of him that hadn't grown back. He had not cried in Kandahar, even in the worst of it. He was 61 years old, and he had made a kind of peace with the things the world had taken from him, because the alternative was to not make peace with them, and what good would that have done? He picked up his coat from the counter. He held it for a moment, then he folded it carefully, the way it had always been folded, and he tucked it under his arm. He turned to Dylan Asare, and he said the only thing there was to say, "What's your name again?" "Dylan, Dylan." He said it like he was writing it somewhere. "Who's your family from?" "My dad's Ghanaian. My mom's from Hamilton." Aubrey nodded once. "My wife's family is from Hamilton," he said. "Dundas area, originally." He looked at the young man for a moment more. "You just sold your grandmother's watch." "I know. You didn't have to do that." Dylan Asar was quiet for a second. "I know," he said again. "Look to." There was a pause in which neither of them said anything, and the shop was very quiet, and outside on Dundas Street, Toronto went on being Toronto, indifferent and enormous and completely unaware that anything had happened here. Then Aubrey Okafor did something that Dylan Asare would think about for a long time afterward. He unclipped one of the medals from the coat. Not the most decorated one, not the largest, but a particular one, a small silvery disc with a red and white ribbon, and he held it out. "Don't argue with me," Aubrey said. "I've been argued with by people scarier than you." Dylan Asara took the medal with both hands, the way you take something when you understand the weight of it. "That one's from Croatia," Aubrey said. 1993. I was 29. About your age." He picked up the coat and turned toward the door. "You buy yourself a good coat when you get the money. February in this city is not something to negotiate with." He pushed the door open, and the mechanical bell made its complaint, and the cold came in briefly, and then he was gone. Here's what happened after. Dylan Asare did have a difficult conversation with his landlord, a Ukrainian man named Kovalenko, who'd lived through harder things than a late rent check, and who said, without any drama, "Fine, end of the month, don't make it a habit." Dylan didn't make it a habit. He paid on time for the next 18 months and then moved out when he finally got the job at the Veterans Advocacy Office that he'd been applying for since September. The job came through in part because of a reference from a man named Aubrey Okafor, who'd sat on the hiring committee in a volunteer capacity and who'd recognized the name on the application and who'd said, when asked about his recommendation, he understands what it means to show up. That's all he said. It was enough. Aubrey Okafor got the heating bill paid and the prescription filled and enough groceries to see February out. His daughter called that weekend. She was living in Vancouver by then, working as a civil engineer, the kind of work that required a precision he'd always recognized in her, even when she was small and arranging her crayons by color in a way that suggested she had standards. He didn't tell her about the pawn shop. He told her Toronto was cold and she should call her mother more often. She told him she called her mother every 3 days and that he should eat more vegetables. He said he ate plenty of vegetables. He did not eat enough vegetables. His car got fixed in March. He fixed it himself with parts he ordered online, and it took him a Saturday and most of a Sunday, and his back was bothering him by the end of it. But it started on the first turn of the key, and he sat in the driver's seat for a minute with the engine idling and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than pride. The satisfaction of a thing working the way it was supposed to work after a period of it not working. The dress uniform stayed in the garment bag. He didn't put it back in the closet. He hung it on the back of the bedroom door where he could see it. His wife asked why. He said he'd explain sometime. She was the kind of woman who knew when to wait, and she waited. And one evening in April, he told her the whole story, including the part about the young man with his grandmother's watch, and she listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd always loved most about her. "You took the medal back," she said when he finished. "No," he said. "I didn't take it back." She looked at him. "I gave it to him," Aubrey said. "That's different." Dylan Asari put the medal in the same box as his grandmother's watch. Not as a replacement. You can't replace a thing like that, but beside it, because they were both things that had passed through hands that understood their weight, and he thought they belonged together. He still has the box. It's on a shelf in his apartment, A different apartment now, a better one, on the other side of the city. He doesn't look at it every day. But sometimes when something has gone wrong, or when the world feels very loud, or when he walks past someone at a store who is counting coins very carefully at a register and trying not to look up, he thinks about a Tuesday in February on Dundas Street, and about a 61-year-old man who walked into a pawnshop with the last good thing he owned and walked out still holding it. He thinks about that, and then he pays for what he can pay for, and he goes home. Not every kindness announces itself. Not every debt gets recorded. Some things just pass quietly between people, in the back of a pawn shop on a February afternoon when the wind is coming off the lake, and they travel outward from there in ways nobody tracks and nobody names. They just travel.